Okay, the first one will be this more general question. There's a Middle East peace process, but there's also a Middle East that's full of a history of suspicion, hatred, warfare. What is the best that we should hope for from this Middle East peace process? How well will these people ever get along?
Well, you know, Peter, the very terms of reference are terms that I don't really quite see it the same way. It's not really a question of, are these people unable to get along, whereas Westerners are able to get along, and there's a peace process, and is this peace process going to work? The Middle East has been subjected to a history of chicanery and duplicity, and one group has been set against the other, going back to the Ottoman period. And then in the aftermath of the Ottoman period, the Western powers came in. They called the 1919 conference the Paris Peace Conference. But in reality, the Paris Peace Conference was the peace to end all peace. They carved up the Middle East into artificial regimes. They played one group off against the other. One Western power played one country off against the other. And the fact that these conflicts exist is not because these people are genetically any different than us, not because they have conflict ingrained in them. It's because their social, political, and economic structures were set up in a way in the aftermath of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire so as to pursue these conflicts and force these conflicts. Now, the average American listening to this might say, you know, what's this? Why would we want to do that? Why would the West want to have conflict and one group against the other? But the answer is not that obscure. The resources of the Middle East, what are the resources of the Middle East? The resources are black gold. Huge wealth that the industrial age needed. The British and the French knew this even before the Americans did. The competition over that wealth, the petro companies, the intrigues of the 20s and 30s and 40s. So what you've got now is the aftermath of the setup of tribal regimes, family regimes, client regimes. Just about all the regimes in the Middle East are undemocratic. Just about all of them are unpopular. And just about all of them owe their origins to British intelligence or later on to the American CIA. We just went through the peace signing between the Hashemite regime in Jordan and the Israelis. Very few people even bothered to mention that just 15 years ago it was public knowledge that King Hussein was publicly, almost publicly, on the payroll of the CIA and had been throughout most of his life. These facts, when they're not brought forward and when they're not repeated and when they're not told to the everyday audience that's hearing about peace conference, peace signings, new deals, new arrangements, make it difficult for the average person to understand that there's a huge entrenched history to the problems we're living through. Take the term peace process. Everybody calls it peace process. Everybody suggests, everybody in the Western world suggests that something new and tremendous has happened in the last few years in the aftermath of the Gulf War. Well, that's not how I see it. I see the agreements that have been made as very much consistent with what American foreign policy in the Middle East has been since the end of World War II. Very much consistent with Roosevelt's meeting with Ibn Saud on the ship, the famous meeting where the king of Saudi Arabia brought his goats and brought his tent and put it up on the ship. What was that meeting all about? It was to say, you ship us cheap oil, we protect you. We don't care about democracy. We don't care about human rights. We don't care about whether there's internal conflict and strife. All we care about is you must give our oil companies concessions so that our oil companies can pump oil in large quantities in cheap amounts. We then give you money and intelligence backing so that you stay in power because we want to be in control of the oil. That then led to a situation where year after year after year it wasn't just oil. It was regimes, it was economic arrangements, it was Boeing airplanes, it was petrodollars. Soon there was not only the wealth of oil, but there was the wealth of petrodollars, and we needed to control those dollars as well. And this is all independent of the Israeli Zionist issue. This would have been there even without the extra tension that was created by the creation of Israel.
Well, we've heard a lot of these arguments before. We've heard arguments about ulterior motives for the outside world's interest in the Middle East. But we have to face this reality that this peace process has been entered into, willingly it would appear, by all the participants. The Palestinians are involved, Israel and all its neighboring states are involved. There must be something to this process, or why are they in it?
Well, I don't think that's correct either. The peace process, if I'm to use your language, which I don't really accept as the correct language, I would say what's happening in the Middle East today is that two factors came into play in the last 10 years, three factors. The end of the Cold War, meaning there was no longer the major competition between the Soviets and the Americans. Two, the rise of Islamic nationalist fundamentalism, which is actually midwifed by Western involvement, because who are these people reacting against? Who are they fighting against? They're fighting against the client regimes that have been imposed on them. And then three, of course, you've got the Israeli involvement in the affairs of the region. Israel started off as a small, weak power, but has become the dominant nuclear power. You have a state of 4 million Jews dominating the affairs of the region with over 200 million Arab, mostly Muslims, some Christians. So all these factors came into play. What you've got is a political process that after the Gulf War was pushed forward by the Americans. The Americans had just destroyed an Arab country, and they had participated in the destruction of Iran by encouraging Iraq to attack Iran in the first place. The Americans, I think, felt a desperate need for a public relations victory, that they be perceived not as an empire, but more as a good Samaritan. Now, imagery is very important in the Middle East, even more important than in the Western world. And that imagery of going to Madrid, creating a peace process, was very important, I think, to the Bush administration. Now, the Israelis had been in favor of this kind of thing all along. Shamir gave the impression that he was kicked and dragged and screaming and hollering. Shamir wanted, as all Israelis have wanted, to sit at a table with the Arab states and be accepted. It was a form of legitimacy even before there were any signed agreements. The Palestinians had been defeated. I mean, let's call it straight. There is no PLO anymore. The PLO was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Israelis, the Americans, and by Arab regimes that were afraid of it. And in the aftermath of the Gulf War, it was a good time to stop the funding, stop the pretense. Yasser Arafat hardly existed at that moment. He was literally bankrupt. He was a figurehead that had nowhere to go. His choices were either simply abdication and acknowledging his total defeat, or he did what many Arab leaders have done over the years. He allowed himself to become another client regime. He was bought by his enemies, who said to him essentially the following: you're not going to get a state, you're not going to get what you've been fighting for, your people are vanquished, but if you, Yasser Arafat, will go and take charge, because we don't want to take charge. There's this place, Gaza. 1 million Palestinians living in poverty, turning into Hamas terrorists. We've had our fill of it. I've heard the Israelis since the 70s talk about the Gaza First option. And the impression is given that the Israeli Labor Party turned over some big new leaf and all of a sudden decided to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. That's all nonsense. The Israeli Labor Party, going back to the 60s with the Alon Plan, had always said that pockets of Palestinian population should be autonomously administered by the Palestinians, preferably in combination with Jordan. They insisted on what they called security rights, the right to settle. Basically, they've taken 72% of the land, most of the water resources. They've encased Jerusalem in an Israeli-Jewish concubine arrangement. So the PLO was gone. This wasn't something that was done willingly. This was more like Geronimo being told to hand over his gun and he won't be shot. And I don't know if you recall that Yasser Arafat actually, it's unbelievable, he actually, at the White House ceremony, wanted to hand over his gun to the President of the United States right there on the podium. That's how bad the whole thing had gotten. Now, of course, the imagery of presenting this is different. You tell the American people in the world, we've achieved a breakthrough. All the parties have come to the negotiating table. Well, who are the parties that have come to the table? The government of Egypt, which is essentially a military government. You redress generals in civilian uniforms, you give them American money and CIA protection, and an unpopular regime continues to rule Egypt. What is the Hashemite regime? Put there by the British, by Winston Churchill, by British funds, by CIA funds, and imposed on Jordan. What is the Saudi regime? The Saud family. What is the Al-Sabah family? There's no semblance of democracy or human rights in any of these places. It's the complete opposite of what Bill Clinton says every time he gets up and speaks about the subject. But the average American hasn't been to these places. The average American has a hard enough time remembering American history and the Civil War and the war against Britain. If you try to explain to the average American that the Palestinian PLO, when it was in existence, that the Hamas of today, that the nationalist revolutionaries in the Arab world see themselves like Paul Revere, see themselves like they are fighting against when the Americans fought against the British, that they don't want taxation without representation. They don't want to be ruled by foreigners. They don't want to have to pay homage to a foreign king. Now, the average American can then begin to, realize that maybe there's a whole side to this, the whole way of looking at this problem in the Middle East, these problems in the Middle East that they haven't been exposed to. And when you start looking at it through these different lenses and in these different ways, you begin to reach very different conclusions.
And now, this week's quote of the week. This week, a rather unusual quote, Howard Kurtz from Newsweek and the Washington Post. Quote, "What the Windows Blitz reminds us above all is that we live in an ad-saturated culture in which the art of salesmanship has reached undreamed of heights. Anything, a corporate merger, a basketball shoe, a contract with America, can be packaged and peddled the way Rush Limbaugh sells that stuffed crust stuff from Pizza Hut. Windows was pitched as a cultural event, complete with Mick Jagger's soundtrack." Unquote. Anything, yes, anything, even the putting of Palestinians onto separate and barricaded reservations and the beating into submission of those who oppose, all in the name of quote-unquote peace process. Anything, even the terms moderate physical force and shaking, to rhetorically disguise the prevalence of, indeed the increasing reliance on, out-and-out torture, and by both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Anything, even the promotion of Israel, of Jerusalem as the city of peace, when in fact the Israelis are working furiously to make sure it never will be. Anything, even the upcoming election of Yasser Arafat.
One of the things that many Americans would say they understand about the Middle East is that there's a threat there, something that worries them a lot. And this is the phenomenon that's understood in the Western press as Muslim fundamentalism. Tell me what you think are the consequences of what appears to be an increase in support for so-called Muslim fundamentalists, what they'll do to this peace process, as illegitimate and as ill-conceived as it might be, and how the people who are now supporting the fundamentalist leaders could be perhaps persuaded or inclined away from them.
Well, I'm a secular person myself, and a Jewish person by background, origin, intellect, existential identity. I don't know too many fundamentalists on a personal level, but I've been to the region, as you well know, 150 times in the last 20 years, and I've met many of them in passing. I have always been quite impressed with their dignity, with their thoughtfulness, with their articulation of their grievances. If we stay away from theological issues where I don't happen to share, but then again, I don't share much with Jerry Falwell and the Christian fundamentalists in the United States either. So I don't find the Islamic fundamentalist movement frightening in itself. But on the other hand, I consider the fundamentalist movement to have been midwifed by American and European imperialism, if you want to use the old term. If you beat a people long enough, if you trick them enough times, if you have them enough times, if you, I use the word have because when I got to Cairo just a few weeks ago, upper-class Egyptian woman, very well educated, her first comment on the phone before inviting me over for caviar and champagne was to say, "We've all been had, haven't we, Mark?" They know they've been had. They know that their regimes have been imposed. They know that their governments have been infiltrated. They know that the West dominates their economy. They know it's easier to fly to New York and Washington and London than it is from one Arab capital to the next. They know that development in their region has been squashed because the petrodollars have gone to American and Western banks, not into investment and building up their own societies. Now, if you know these things, and you're a proud Arab and a proud Muslim, then you do the same thing that anybody does. You speak up, you fight, you demand your independence, you demand your rights. Now, for the West to be entering a conflict with Islamic fundamentalism at this time in history is terribly dangerous. It seems that the West desires an external enemy. Maybe it's the old Eisenhower military-industrial complex warning that the military-industrial complex feels a need to define an enemy because it wants the resources of our own societies to be put into building more planes, building more intelligence services, giving more money to the National Security Agency. Isn't it amazing that in the aftermath of the Cold War, when we fought the Soviet Empire, the major American national security institutions haven't been cut back very much. And in fact, Bill Clinton is arguing to increase the American defense budget. So Islamic fundamentalism, to me, is not a very dangerous or a very hard to understand movement. We've got Christian fundamentalism. Look at Jewish fundamentalism. Look at it this way. There's only one state in the Middle East that defines itself on a religious basis, and that, of course, Saudi Arabia is different, so maybe there's more than one state. But I was going to say that the Israelis in modern times brought the concept of religious nationalism to the Middle East and imposed it on the Middle East. Now, as a Jew who lost most of his ancestors in the Holocaust, I'm very aware why the Jewish people did that. And if I were alive and fighting at that time in history, I probably would have been helping Jewish refugees escape the ovens and the furnaces of Europe and found a country called Israel in a place called Palestine. I probably would have been doing that. But nevertheless, it wasn't the Muslim Middle East that destroyed the Jews of Europe. It was the Christian world that brought the Holocaust upon the Jews. And when those refugees left on boats to found Israel on the soil of Palestine, everybody called it Palestine then, there was no secret that it was Arab Palestine, who wouldn't let them in? It was the Americans and the European governments that wouldn't let the ships land and wouldn't let the refugees come and forced those refugees onto the Arabs. Now, the fact that the Arabs then fought against the foreign invaders, if you will, who, by the way, had always told them they were never going to set up a Jewish state. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, spent the 30s and the early 40s telling every Arab leader he could find, we have not come here to dominate you, we have not come here to set up a Jewish state, we want to live in peace, the Jewish people, the Arab people, in this country. That changed after World War II. The same duplicity and treachery that the Labour Party imposed on the region at that time, saying one thing and working for another thing, is what's happening today. The Israelis come forward and they say, we're going to make peace with the Palestinians. But then they impose a system of Middle East apartheid on the Palestinians, and then we all wonder, why are the Palestinians depressed? Why are they fighting? Why are they turning into Hamas revolutionaries? Why are they blowing people up? They're doing it for the same reasons that all people rebel against being forced into submission. And if I were a Palestinian today, unlike 1947, and I saw my people being pushed onto reservations, their land taken, stolen, all the lies, all the duplicity, all the press misrepresentations, and I didn't have a chance to come on TV, to make a CD-ROM, to write in the newspapers, my only option was to fight and die for my cause or my people, that's what you or I or many of us might be doing. And they're no more radical than any of us. We have different outlets for our energies and our passions.
You're painting a very pessimistic picture of this, and I understand why you're doing it. Perhaps the most contentious issue to be discussed hasn't even been raised yet. This peace process expects to find a solution to the long problem of Jerusalem, jurisdiction over that city, access to its religious sites. And Jerusalem is more than just a place where people practice their religion. It's caught up in the nationalist aspirations of people as well. Can the peace process even address in a real way the issue of Jerusalem?
Look, people don't like to go out on limbs and give yes and no answers because they could be proved wrong, and if you give a yes or no answer, you're easily quotable. So usually you get very convoluted answers that are very hard to understand. The answer is no, because the Israelis have already acted in ways that have made a fair and just resolution of the Jerusalem issue impossible. Now, what do I mean by fair and just? Jerusalem, at the time of the '67 war, was a dual city. It had about an equal population division. There was a Jewish Jerusalem, there was an Arab Jerusalem. There still is an Arab Jerusalem, but it's been turned into more a ghetto. It's more like Harlem in New York now. Nice people don't go there if they don't have to. And the police don't even like to go there. The Israelis have built settlements all around Jerusalem. They have starved the Palestinians, refused to give them work permits, refused to give them building permits, refused to let them develop their own society. After a generation of this, going back to the takeover in '67, Jerusalem today, from the south, from the Bethlehem area where you can see Gilo, to the Ramallah area where you can see the Jewish settlements coming at you, to Male Adonim on the way to Jericho and to Jordan. Jerusalem has essentially already been turned into a Jewish city with a small Arab ghetto. And in that context, the only possible resolution is for the Palestinians to again surrender. Now, they can say we've reached a settlement. They can say that we've reached an arrangement. But it isn't going to be an arrangement that's going to be either workable on the ground or even saleable through any sort of argument. Anybody who looks at the map and drives around is going to see what's happened. What does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean war. The Hashemite regime is cooperating in this. But then again, the Hashemite regime has cooperated for 50 years with the Zionist movement. There's nothing new in that either. King Hussein's been meeting with Israeli leaders going back to Golda Meir. So there too, all the hype about something new having happened. The new that happened is that the king decided to come out in public and decided to open up the doors of tourism and travel, mostly for economic reasons, and also because he got promises that the Mossad and the CIA will come to his defense if there should be a revolution, which is what he has feared the most ever since he took over. On the other hand, isn't it interesting that this king has not set foot in Jerusalem since the day his grandfather was assassinated? Well, no, he actually did come after that, but he was with his grandfather when his grandfather was assassinated. So what did he do? After the ceremony in Washington, he flew his jet over, sort of waved the wings a bit. The Israelis closed down all the airspace, and that gave the impression, apparently to him and his followers, that the Hashemites were back. Well, to me, it gave the opposite impression. It gave the impression that they're afraid to even go there. They don't know what to do. So he flies over and pretends, like Arabs love to pretend. He pretends that he's back in Jerusalem and that the peace process is achieving something for Arab dignity.